The chamber had been a long time without laughter. The light inside it came shallow and buttery from a row of fat beeswax tapers, the flames wavering in the slightest drift that came beneath the door and tugged faintly at the edge of the great map on the table. The map was tan with age and pocked with pinholes, rivers drawn as patient blue veins, mountains a lift of inked shadow like scars that had settled into a face. There were stones laid along borders, iron nails with strips of parchment affixed to them, the names of captains and castellans written in Tywin Lannister's hard, unornamented hand. The stones were heavy and cold when moved. There was a habit to the weight of them, a remembrance in his palms of things wrenched into place and made to stay there. Outside, King's Landing kept breathing. Somewhere the last green stink of wildfire still clung to a courtyard wall, faint this far from the river, a ghost that would not admit to being gone. Horses snorted in the gates. A cart went over a rut and groaned. The men in the hall below stamped their boots, and one of them loosed a cough he tried to swallow. A maidservant passed with a pitcher and kept her head bowed, and a boy with ink-stained fingers lingered by the door as if near heat, waiting to be needed. Tywin did not look up. He had the letter from Sunspear open and its seal broken, the parchment held flat beneath a small figure of a lion wrought in red stone. Even before he read, he had known it would be slow words and measured, and polite as a closed gate. Doran Martell wrote like a man who watched the tide place shells upon the sand and counted them and did not move even when one slid back into the water. Your Grace, he had written to Joffrey, your servant remembers the old oaths and honors the betrothal that binds Myrcella Baratheon to Trystane Martell. The princess is safe and cherished, and will be cherished all her days in Dorne. The water gardens are gentle. She is a child. She learns the names of our trees and our birds. He had put little of himself into the words, but the little that had leaked was true enough. Dorne would not be rushed. Cersei had been in this room earlier, and the shape of her displeasure still hung here like a cloak shedding cold. Bring her home, she had said, and then, when he did not commit himself in the beat of a heart, do you not hear me? He had heard her. He had made himself hear only the words and not the mother who spoke them. A mother's fear swelled like a thing with teeth, chewed at judgment. Sit, he had said, and then when she did not, he had said nothing more. She left with the gowned rustle of a woman who had always been seen and must be seen always. He had noticed, because he noticed everything, that she had left the flagon untouched and the cup by it clean. It was good. Wine dulled edges that had to be kept bright. He moved a nail half an inch so it pressed into the painted line of the green fork. The Riverlands were always a pain that could be borne until it turned rot inside the flesh. Above the river a bit of parchment read Fry, and in a second hand that was not his, we could have crossed if he had opened. Next to it another tag, Blackfish at large, the letters a shade too emphatic. He knew the eagerness that lay underneath. He did not dislike eagerness. It was a vein of or that could be smelted and beaten hard and used until it broke. My lord! The boy at the door had taken 3 steps in, and stood now as if the floor beneath him was marked with squares he must not leave. A rider waits. He wears no colors. He says a word for your ear. Tywin set the lion to one side and folded the map's corner back over Dorne's coast as if the desert might be kept folded. Send him in, he said. The boy ducked his head and vanished. And at once there was the faint scrape of a boot upon stone and the rider took shape in the doorway. Tall, the dust of the rose road on his cloak. The glance of a man who had learned to measure rooms by how his shoulders might fit through each door. He went to one knee before he spoke. My lord Hand, he said. From the Trident. I came via Maidenpool. Tywin studied him as he would study a new tool before he placed it to work. No badge of house or hireling company. No brooch. The man smelled of leather and river silt and he held his tongue while he was weighed. Stand, Tywin said. Say your word. The rider stood, took a breath as if he were tasting the room's air for poison, and said in a voice that had been taught to be steady, a fish on a field of blood, and this beneath it, a truce written to be read by lions, comes from Riverrun. They bid it be placed not in the hands of any lesser. A truce. He had known it was coming. You saw the weather while it still lay half a day off the coast. Robb Stark's young victories had stopped adulthood's cold way. If the boy had truly become a man, he would already have been forced to be content with the slow bleed of attrition and the lean years of siege. Instead, he had a warband that still thought of war as the right to shout. Someone older stood by him and did sums. Tywin set his hands upon the table on either side of the reach and leaned the smallest part of his weight forward. "Bring it." He stood as the rider came and held out the parchment, its gray ribbon tied with a single knot that had been unsettled and retied too many times. He cut it, shook it open, and read. The language was Catelyn Tully's before it was any man's. He could taste the prayer of it even as it pretended to be a list. It asked to be heard because it was reasonable, not because it was right. It did not wait for an answer. It asked that each request work upon the next until a hole was made. There would be cessation of raiding all along the Red Fork and the Tumblestone. There would be safe passage for messengers of the crown via whichever road they chose. In exchange, Riverrun and the castles of the Trident would open their gates not to Lannister garrisons but to bread and salt, and each side would return those captives they were honor-bound to return. There was a line that named Sansa Stark, and a father who had died, and a sister whose fate was unknown. There was a line that named Jaime Lannister and did not cry out as it did. There was a line at the end that had been placed there last of all, after the ink was dry, because the thought had not borne writing. If there is kindness still within the lion's heart, and a father's love, then we ask that he hear a mother. Return your daughter from Dorne, that ours may be returned from your city, and let the swords sleep a while. Tywin felt the old ache that had nothing to do with age. You did not read your children on paper. You counted them on your fingers in private, and in the dark if needed. He folded the truce once and again, and set it under the lion he had moved, as if such a weight could hold it steady. "Answer," he said to the rider. "This night, you will carry it." The man bowed his head and stood out again into the corridor's lamp smoke and voices. Tywin stood alone with the sound of the city and the slow sizzle of candle wicks when a drift of air came and teased one flame sideways, a thin spear of light that threatened to gutter and did not. He placed 2 fingers upon Dorne where the map ribboned into pale coast, and pressed as if he might feel beneath vellum the bone of that land. Doran Martell would meet Truce with patience. Then, with some demand that had hung in his blood these long years like sediment in a vessel never quite poured out. "Give us justice. Give us some shape we can call it by." Tywin had not been the man who drove a sword into Elia Martell. The men who had were tools, and that they had been his tools did not matter if the work had been needful. But even needful work left filings on the floor. If that grit could be swept and contained and measured to a coin's worth, he would pay it into a bag and give it to Dorne's hand and not feel the loss. The plan made itself because plans that are the size of a man's hand and not a house or a hill always do. He rang for the boy. He sent for Kevan first, and then for Pycelle, and then for Varys, because you laid your table in that order lest the course in front run dry before the wine reached it. When they were come, a shuffle of slippers, a scrape of chair legs, Varys with his soft hands folded and his lids lowered in deference. Tywin spoke as if he were remarking upon the weather. "We are at war on too many fronts," he said. "One front offers us a truce, and we will accept it." He did not pause to watch them measure the shape of that. "Our quarrel with Dorne must be swallowed and digested as quietly as the swallowing can be made. They are to return the Princess Myrcella at once. In exchange, we will send them justice. Ser Kevan, I will give you the writs. Clegane is to be seized and delivered alive into Dornish hands. Ser Amory Lorch is to be found, whether he has taken himself to the ends of the earth or no. His head will serve if his body will not." Kevin's jaw tightened so slightly it might have been a misremembered twitch of a muscle in the candlelight. "Ser Gregor will not be taken easily. Then he will be taken with difficulty," Tywin said, and his voice did not warm or cool. "If he bleeds, he bleeds, but his head must stay fastened until it can be removed in a place of our choosing, and with the words we require said near it." Varys made a small sound that might have been assent and might have been an appreciation of some culinary subtlety. So gentle was it. "The Dornish will notice the shape of this offering. The Dornish will notice its blood, said Pycelle, and lifted his beard in emotion that might once have been authority and now was only habit. "My lord, if I may, the faith will murmur if we deliver one of our knights to foreign vengeance." Tywin let his gaze rest on him long enough to be felt. "The faith may say its prayers for the souls of murdered children," he said. "I will hear them when I desire to be soothed." "Shall we inform the queen?" Kevin asked. "She will be informed when the note is written and not before," Tywin said. "She has work to do that does not include this." He looked to Varys. "I will require a ship of sound keel that can pass to Sunspear without callers who place too many questions upon the deck. Find one whose owner loves coin more than talk." "But of course." Varys' smile was a bow turned sideways. "And the boy with the scar? The other lion? He will wish to." "Tyrion remains as he is," Tywin said. "He will be told what he must be told." He could feel the throne's shadow in this room even when the door was shut and barred 3 times. That iron's weight that had nothing to do with iron. He would not lighten it for any son who had nearly lost him the city while proclaiming himself its savior. "Go," he said. "Bring me what I require." They went. The room took the shape of its emptiness, and for a time Tywin allowed himself to stand motionless, his fingers resting on the lion's head that weighed the truce to the table. He heard again in his mind his daughter's voice, brittle and brilliant as glass in sun. "Bring her home." He saw a girl with hair the color of summer hay in the fields around Casterly Rock, and the stubborn little twist she made with her mouth when she bit back tears she had decided she would not show. He had held Joanna when she had been that small. It had not made him a fool. It did not make him one now. At Riverrun, the river kept forgiving the light that fell upon it and taking it back, forging little knives out of the sun and melting them as often. Catelyn stood at one of the high windows and felt the stones cool on her wrists, and the wind that came up with a scent of green and wet metal. The raven she had sent had flown heavy with her hope. It had returned so quickly she mistrusted it at first, as she mistrusted anything that came too soon and too easy in these years. The reply lay on the table, folded once, the fold knife straight. The wax was red and the stamp clean. The words inside had been plain. "We will take your truce. We will send the man you named to Dorne. We will accept Myrcella back into the capital while we wait upon the answers that must follow. We will restrain raids. You will restrain raids. You will hold your castles and your pride, and I will hold mine. You will return to me those who fought against me. I will return to you those who have fought against you and who lie within my hands. There will be safe conduct for those who go to and from to speak of these matters. There will be an exchange of hostages, the shape of which will be agreed upon in the next letters. Men who break this truce will find no shelter under my roof or my name. Do not mistake this treaty for affection. It is a weight placed upon the scale. Pray that it balances." The name at the bottom was the one that mattered. Tywin Lannister did not use titles when he wrote. It was said he had seen them like ribbons that could be cut and thrown away. He had written only his name. Catelyn had to sit when she had first read it, and must sit again each time she read it, as if her legs did not trust themselves to bear what the words weighed. There was Robb to tell, there was the Blackfish to send for, there was Edmure to summon from wherever he had run to ground with the shallow triumph of the fords still upon his mouth like sweet wet. She had closed her eyes for a moment in the chair and pressed her hands together in a habit that went back to a girl's prayers whispered in Riverrun's September mother. Listen. She had not named which mother she prayed to. There were too many now, and none enough. She found Robb in the great hall that had lost so much shouting it now spoke in echoes. He stood with his hands upon a trestle table, the ghost of a boy's height still folded into his limbs, the new king already scabbed into him. Gray wind lay with his head upon his paws, his eyes open and unblinking, the sort of stillness that is only a pause in movement. When Robb's eyes lifted and found her, they softened and then tightened again, a man's face drawing on over a son's. "Mother?" he said, and then, when she held out the parchment, "You've had word." She watched him read because watching her children do anything had once been the joy of her days. It hurt now and healed both. He read quickly and then more slowly, and at one line, the one that named Jaime, his mouth flattened. He set the parchment down carefully as if it were a hot plate. "He means it," he said, and there was no wonder in his voice, only cool acceptance. "It buys him time on one side to move along another. I had expected it. He cut himself off and closed his hand, his knuckles whitening where the skin mapped bone. "It puts the Riverlands to rights for bread's sake. The small folk can put their heads up. Look," he bent and tapped one of the words as if to nail it in place. "Safe conduct. We can talk across the lines without someone's cousin putting an arrow in someone's cousin. For a little." "And Myrcella," Catelyn said, and then could not say more for a moment. She saw Sansa's face as it had been when she had braided her hair on mornings before court training as lady and smiled into the mirror, because something new would be learned that day, and she would like learning it. She saw Arya with her face bent over needlework she hated, the stray curl that always freed itself and tickled her temple. She pressed down on the pain because to let it run would be to be carried away. If she comes back to King's Landing, Cersei will. She may be more amenable. "Or less," Robb said. "I never thought I would sit counting the softness of a lioness. Yet here I am. Karstark will not like it. He still wants Jaime." He said Jaime the way a man might say hunger, as if the word curled within him. "He will say we feed the men who killed his sons instead of feeding their ghosts." "You will speak to Lord Karstark before the raven flies," said Catelyn. "You will give him a room and close its shutters and tell him what you gain and what you pay. And you will be careful how long you leave him with the shutters closed." Robb smiled without humor. "You say I am king, then make me the sun again. It is good. I had begun to fancy I had a crown inside my skull." "You will wear both," Catelyn said. "One will not sit straight without the other." He looked past her a moment to some distance a boy could not have seen, then back. "Very well. We shall do it. We shall do it quickly, while those who hate the notion have not yet taught their hatred to others." He leaned to scratch gray wind along the jaw. The dire wolf did not blink. "I will send the Blackfish to meet whichever Lannister they send. Should be Kevin. It will not be Tywin. He will have other iron to heat. He will put it to Dorne." Catelyn imagined Dorne as she had heard it as a girl. A flat, bright place of citrus and knives, a heat that did not relent even at night, women with voices that did not bend, men with eyes like the shadows under fig leaves. Myrcella among that, sweet and stiff, a child taught to walk on embroidery without marking it. She would have smiled to please the prince she was to marry. She would have learned the names of the birds and repeated them as if in a lesson. She would have watched the sea and thought of the other sea that was a river with ships always crying on it. "He will give them Clegane," Catelyn said, and surprised herself with the surety in her voice. "He is too proud to be called merciful. He will choose a justice that looks like a blow." Across the narrow sea's long leg of coast, the water gardens wore their light like silk. A boy ran in the shallows, shrieking in that wordless voice that is closest to joy, and a girl caught him by a wrist and spun him, and both fell laughing into warm water. The sun fell through the leaves of the orange trees in coins upon the tiles, and the breeze carried a scatter of bloom sent low over the shining of the pools. Hota leaned on his long axe with a sentry's ease. He had watched this same pool for years and found his mind smoothed by it. The children were many-colored and made one color in motion. Pleased him. It had pleased his prince once to say the same. "Here," Doran had whispered back when he could still go down into the water with his sandals in one hand. "Here the realm that could be." The prince sat now under a shade that moved as shadows moved across his chair. His leg bandaged close and his pain hidden so well that only years of watching told Hoda it existed at all. Next to the chair, the Princess Myrcella stood with her skirts gathered to her calves, her hair like white wine, talking with Trystane, who looked at her as if something had surprised him and kept surprising him every day. She had a little chip of shell she held to one ear and said, "I can hear the sea." And Trystane had said, "I hear you're hearing the sea." And they had laughed not because it was clever, but because they were delighted that their words made any bridge at all. A letter had come from the capital that morning, and another from the Trident by way of Gulltown. Doran listened to words until something like fatigue came into him that no one else heard, because he listened always. "They want her back," he said. "They will give us the mountain." Arianne, who stood at the back of the arbor with a hand on a slim tree where the bark flaked, made a small sound that fitted her mouth and not her throat. "They bring a man to us like a gift," she said, "and think that by doing so they buy a debt, as if we counted as they count." "It is not payment," said Doran. He reached for a slice of orange and lifted it and then set it back as if the fragrance must be tasted. "First, they send what we asked for before we asked out loud." He nodded to Ariohoda and the captain bent. "We have waited. It is our way. But sometimes the waiting is seen and made work for you." Arianne moved into the light, her eyes heavy-lidded the way the women at Planky Town still wrote songs about, though he had to tell many of those women to be silent with only his gaze. She said, "The girls will want the mountain's blood on stones. They will say to lay him flat in the sun and weight him with iron until the breath stops. They will say to cut from him the parts that made his laughter when Elia died." "Obara will say it loudest," Ario said, in a tone as matter-of-fact as the grain of his axe haft. "Then Enwam will whisper something that sounds quieter and kills as well. Tywin will cry and count his sins. The little one will look at me to see what I believe." "Myrcella," Doran said softly, "what does the wind say of going home?" The girl lifted her face into the dapple. She had Tristane's hand in hers, and she did not let it go immediately, but neither did she hold it as if she must keep it. "I have been at home here," she said with a child's solemn certainty, "and I will be at home there." She considered a thought and then added, "I learn both." It was politely meant and deeply true, and Ario felt something in his chest that was not pride precisely and not regret. She leaned her head to Tristane's shoulder and whispered something that made him smile helplessly, as if he were in the hands of a tide. "They will return her and then expect us to be grateful," Arianne said. "And if we are, they will say it was because their hand was kind." "Let them misname their reasons," said Doran. He looked past Myrcella, past his son, and perhaps beyond the water itself. "We will not name ours." When the ship came in that Varys had found, its hull sat a finger lower than it ought, which meant the owner knew always to load until the sea climbed to kiss his planking. It had a woman's name and no painted eyes. It had a captain with a mouth that had learned to make the smallest shape that meant yes. He bowed so low at the docks of King's Landing that his hat nearly floated away and had to be rescued with a boot during the bow. "We call at Tarth and Storm's End if asked," he promised, "and keep our flags tucked and our tongues as well." Tywin had considered for a flicker that a row of warships would be more fitting to send to Sunspear, a line of black gulls across the horizon to show intent, and then he let the thought go. Warships frothed the sea to vigor and drew eyes. He wanted to make a thing that would be noticed only when it was done. "Sir," said Kevin quietly as they stood on the quays and watched the ship's captain direct the loading of sealed casks that were not wine and crates that were not figs. "Are we giving too much for too little?" Tywin did not turn his head. "It is never too much to give what you cannot keep. Could we keep Clegane if we desired to keep Dorne? No. Then we spend him, and if the price this day is Myrcella, the coin is fair." Clegane did not come easily. The men who had been sent for him had bled. Qyburn had stood at a landing, his hands white around the banister, and said with a voice too soft, "My lord, the man is subject to fevers that will not be borne kindly at sea. There are humors. There is a writ," Tywin had said. "Warrants stamped the shape of the realm upon the living." He did not permit them to be argued with by those who had made themselves doctors because they liked cutting more than they liked holding men's hands. "If he dies before he reaches Sunspear, I will place you in a cart with his corpse, and the cart will go where the ship went, and you will ride with him until the worms decide which of you tastes more sweet." Qyburn had stopped talking. Ser Meryn led the men who took the mountain. It had not been beautiful. A horse had screamed once in the yard, and a man had been flung from an upper window, so that he hit the cobbles with a sound like a dropped cask and lay with his leg bent into a question he would never answer. Clegane had been brought down finally by iron and numbers, his mouth red with someone else's meat. They had wrapped him in chains and then in chains again until he looked like a winter hedge grown cruel. In the end, he had watched Tywin with a look that had very little in it, but that little was close to what a dog shows when it realizes the master has given it away. It did not trouble him. Pity was fine bone china kept on a high shelf for feast days. This was not one. Letters went back and forth. The blackfish rode out and returned, his face carved but his eyes too bright. He gave reports as if he were reading them from his own skin. Ser Kevin was the one who came, he said. He held one hand on the treaty table and kept the other in the air to show he meant no tricks. They like to have both hands visible while they pick your pocket with their feet. But this time there were no feet. He sent bread before he sent questions. What did you feed him? Robb asked. My face, said Brynden, and there was humor in it. The dry sort that lived in a rocky place and knew where the springs were. That and the sight of your banners kept at the ridge and not snapping at his ear. His gaze went to Catelyn, and in it she felt a quiet that had often saved her as a girl when she had thought some tide was dragging her small, and the blackfish had smiled a way that told her she was still standing. We will have caravans over the Red Fork again. Your people will eat Robb. Edmure sat at the end of the table with the look of a boy who had broken something and been told it did not matter and could not decide whether to be grateful or aggrieved. And what of me? He said finally, a little wild where he had meant to be wry. They told me I kept Ser Gregor from the fords. Now he goes to Dorne and I am supposed to shake my head and say I am content that he will not rot hanging from my gate. You will be content that mothers in your countryside will sleep, said Brynden gently. If you are too proud to be content for that, I will find a sack and tie it over your head until such time as you have learned. Edmure flushed, then squeezed his eyes shut and breathed out. I will be content, he said in a smaller voice. I will put a table in the yard and set out 4 loaves. I will cut them fairly. I will eat what is given me. Catelyn watched them and said nothing of the sign the gods had given. She had learned to hold her tongue between her teeth and taste the iron of it. At the Red Keep, the Queen did not learn of Clegane's departure until the ship was already 3 days out. Cersei came to the Tower of the Hand with the sort of movement that has elbows hidden inside silk, and stood without sitting. What have you done? She asked, too calmly. Justice, said Tywin, and wrote a line that had needed writing on a document that had nothing to do with justice or with Clegane. Sit, he said then, and this time she did, as if she had not meant to at all. You send away a sword we needed. I sent away a blade whose habit of cutting made enemies for us beyond the enemies we required. He set down his quill and met his daughter's gaze. Do you love your children? I have bled for them, she said, and one of her hands closed around the chair's arm so that her knuckles rose like small white stones under the skin. You will bleed differently now, he said. You will learn to bear the wound of not striking. You will receive your daughter back into the city, and you will go down to the quay when the ship comes and make a spectacle of calling Doran Martell brother and kissing the child whom he returns. You will do it because it is our will and because the city must see you do it. She lifted her chin. And what will you do, father? What pain will you take? I will hold the truce with a boy who named himself king until it becomes more expensive than it is now. I will disguise our strength as patience. I will sell pieces that can be spared in a game where the board is not flat at all and the corners are studded with knives. That is my pain. It is the only one I have ever believed in. She stood then, the silk whispering as if it wished to betray her. You bargain with wolves to beg favors from snakes, and you call it wisdom. I call it work, he said. It saves you from the work of grief. Tyrion heard of Clegane's seizure one night later than the rest, because that is when people remembered to tell him things, after the meal when the plates had gone and the wine had drained and someone had said, oh. He had been turning a small piece of bread in his fingers and thinking of Shay's mouth and the way she hid her impatience when he could not come to her. He turned the bread until it was a crumb and then his fingers were sticky with it and he did not like his fingers being sticky. My father sends Ser Gregor to Dorne, he said, and discovered he liked the feel of the words under his tongue. It made him think of Dorne as a mouth with teeth. He drank, and the wine rang the little bell it rang in him always when it went down well. Astonishing. Varys, who had come to his chamber to eat half a peach and say nothing, smiled a sadness. It is astonishing how boring wisdom looks, he said. You have done such work before, my lord Hand. You will do it again. I am not the Hand, Tyrion said, and set the cup down because he did not want to be holding it anymore. I am the scarred dwarf who saved the city and then was told he had not. They will make a song about it one day, if they think anyone cares to sing it. They will call it something pretty, the valor of others. There was bile in him, and he rolled it around and tried to decide whether to keep it. A truce with Robb Stark, he said. It is good. It means I do not need to plan to kill my young nephew's betrothed's father while wearing a feathered hat and juggling 3 knives to distract him at dinner. I had almost taught myself to juggle. Varys laughed the way a cat laughs inside its throat. Your father will require you for other things. He always does. There may be no songs for those either. And the girl, Tyrion said, and it shamed him that the first face that had come to him at the word girl had not been Sansa's. Shay's face, bright and watchful. Myrcella will come to harbor where it stinks of fish and rot and life. Cersei will stand and pose like Mercy on a plinth. The city will believe for half a day that we are kinder than our enemies. Then something will break because things like to break at the wrong time. You are in a mood, Varys said sympathetically. I am in the only mood this city allows me without knocking the cup out of my hand, Tyrion said. Leave me. Send me a whore who does not wish to hear my heart. The last one complained that it interrupted her concentration. On the 4th morning after the ship had slipped, Ariohoda went down to the Sunspear Quay with 20 spears in 2 files that seemed 10 because their steps matched so perfectly that they made a single sound. The ship came on a wind like a hand upon its back. He watched the rigging, the play of shadow in the sail, the shine of salt on plank. He watched the men aboard because the habit of watching was the first habit and perhaps the last. When they handed down chains and a body bound in them, he watched the way the man moved, with deliberation even in constraint. Clegane's eyes were small in his great skull. He turned his head to take in the light not because he loved sun but because it stabbed him and he had learned to allow himself to be stabbed. Areo had watched killers in cities with narrower streets than this and had learned the look. It was rare he looked into a face and thought, yes, this one would be wicked if the world were peaceful, and peace would not cure him. Obara Sand stepped from the shade like a knife coming out into the room. She was in leather and as spare of gesture as a squire before a reprimand. She did not speak until the chains were drawn taut and the men who had drawn them had retreated with their hands kept open to show they held no more links. Ser Gregor, she said. He has not diminished. He will diminish, Areo said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He felt the weight of his axe and remembered the way a wooden handle grows warm under the sun. In the corner of his eye, he saw Tywin's white hands folded as if in prayer, and Nymeria playing a ring through her fingers, and Sarella watching with a scholar's hunger from a place where she had been told she should not be and had come to anyway. He will fit the measure we make for him. Doran's justice did not look like Eliah's blood spilled upon sheets. It looked like a room with a window where the light was allowed to come in, and a bench and a basin of water, and a hand placed upon a man's shoulder when he spoke to remind him of the question he had been asked. When Clegane was placed before that and told what he was being judged for, he smiled. It was brief as a fish rolling in sun, but it was a smile. You do not know it, he said. You do not know how small it all is. We know what you did, said Arianne, who had placed herself to watch and would not apologize for wanting to see with her own eyes. Her hair had been braided tightly away from her face to keep its shadow from falling upon what she observed. Because of what you did, a girl died with her head smashed. Because of what you did, a boy died whose bones never set into a man's body. We will not kill you as small folk do with stones because we are not small folk. We will not kill you as lords do with a sword because you are not a lord. We will diminish you. We will do it slowly. She was surprised that her voice did not shake when she said it. She had expected the memory of Elia told in whispers. Her hands, her hair would tear the words. The words stood. Clegane shrugged and the chains clinked. Do it slowly, he said. I have lived slowly. I can die like that. Ariohoda did not love the sound. He did not love much. He would watch until the watching was over, and then he would stand at the water gardens and watch children climb out of the pool and cross the tiles and drip. When the ship came into King's Landing's Blackwater Bay, it did so at evening, when the day's heat had been folded into cloth and put aside. Men said later that the whole city had known before the sails were visible that it was the one that bore the princess home, as if the water spelt her name out for those who could read it far from shore. The quays were lined with girls and fishwives, and men in rusty mail, and a boy with a tallow candle though the light was not needed, and a septon holding a cracked icon and murmuring words of welcome as if to a saint. There were house banners that had been brought down, badly mended along their hems, and soldiers keeping a corridor that was not wide enough and would never be. Cersei stood at the forefront with hair like a banner of her own, and a gown the precise green of certain leaves in the gardens of Casterly Rock. She had chosen no jewelry but the one ring that had been her mother's. She did not know why she had done that until she saw it on her hand, and then she knew she had hoped that jewel would make her steadfast in some way no one else could. Joffrey beside her was restless and breathed through his mouth as if the smell of the river had offended him personally. Tommen bounced upon the balls of his feet until she put a hand on his shoulder and felt the jump settle. She could feel eyes upon her face. She made herself into the thing they expected to see. The woman's name on the ship's side came clear. The rope sang as it was thrown and then caught. The gangplank was a tongue stuck out at the shore, and someplace a trumpet sounded too early and someone cursed. Then there she was, at the plank's head, with her hand upon the captain's sleeve to steady herself. A girl taller than when she had left and thinner and sure in that way of children who have been told they are safe and have believed it. She paused, because she had always been careful, and looked along the line of faces as if she could see hers there, the one that would be hers to go to. Cersei had not intended to move. She moved. The city made a noise that had words inside it and no meaning at all. She held out her arms and Myrcella came into them, and it hurt, because Myrcella had grown and because she held her too hard and because Myrcella made a little sound like a breath against her throat and then a second sound that was a laugh and then was a sob. "I have oranges," Myrcella babbled into her shoulder, the words pouring out as if they had been dammed a long time. "There are fountains for drinking. The prince has a falcon, mother. The prince is kind. He will be kind always, I think. His father is thoughtful. There is a man with a beard who has a story for everything. I learned to dance. You will show me in the garden," Cersei said evenly. She did not allow the shaking to travel into her voice. She closed her arms and then opened them in the measure allowed. She kissed her daughter's brow. She turned so that the city might see what had been returned. She did not look to Tywin. She would not. Tyrion stood 3 steps behind them because 3 steps was the place where he could see faces and not be seen as much as he disliked. Shay had wanted to see, and he had told her she was a fool and had her as a fool in his bed anyway that afternoon, and now he was here with the smell of her hair still caught in his mind like a burr. Myrcella looked like a summer field under the first wind. He thought of the truce and how delicate and how damned it was. He thought of Arya Stark wherever she was, with dirt under her nails surely, and Sansa, who would hear in the next hour that the sister of her betrothed had come home to her mother. He had said to a queen once that there was a kindness in him like a sore tooth and that it ached more on colder days. This day was not cold, and it ached anyway. Later that night, when the torches were out along the outer walls and the heat collected in the courtyard as if the day had been poured into a basin there and forgotten, Tywin sat with a goblet untouched and a table of papers. The city had performed its part. The Dornish would receive their iron-bound gift and do what the memory of a murdered princess commanded. The Riverlands would breathe. The North would hold. He had written letters to Lisa Arryn, words smooth as sugared fruit, and a different set to Walder Frey with their own little barbs hidden inside the rind. He had signed a note to Stokeworth and another to Rosby, because the crown's business was tea poured and poured again until the pot was empty and someone broke the pot and then complained there was no tea. He let his gaze go unfocused and permitted himself to feel the size of what he had done and did not say it praised him. Joanna's ghost did not speak in this room. He would not have allowed it, even if it had condescended to do so. He felt only the sum and the subtraction, the balance that had yet to prove itself a balance and not a false card slipped under one side of the scale. In Riverrun, Catelyn walked in the gods' wood, where in this castle the gods were willows and their leaves were the hair old men let grow and combed carefully to hide how much had been lost. The water near the red stone wall of the keep had been made to move by men long dead, and still it moved, as if the dead had taught it the habit well enough that it did not need teachers anymore. She sat on a low stone and let her palms rest where the damp had made the lichen a kind of velvet. Somewhere, a boy she could not think of as a boy had spared his enemies and made justice live far from here because his granddaughter slept where the sea could be heard. She thought of Ned, and the way he had loved clean things, the clean strike of a sword, a clean oath, because he had known the world was not clean and he had needed to hold himself to something that was. The truce was not clean. It had been made with hands that were not washed. That did not mean it would not stand. Arya Stark, who would learn of it much later and be furious that no one had thought to ask her what she wanted, sat at that hour on a rock beside a road that had no name she cared to keep, and gnawed a heel of bread hard as a carpenter's knuckle, and told herself a story in which she had a knife that spoke to her and the knife said, "Now," and she believed it. She did not yet know that a shape she could not stab had been made for her elsewhere, a shape that might carry her back within its hollow. In Dorne, while the mountain breathed under a watch that did not flinch or blink, Oberyn Martell stood beside an open arch with a woman who had wrapped her foot around his leg and watched the stars fall backward, and smiled with his mouth and not his eyes. "They will say this is justice," he said, soft enough that only the woman and the knight could hear, "and perhaps it is, but it is not mine." He lifted the wine in his hand and drank. He liked this vintage. It bruised the tongue in a way that made it feel used. "No matter. I will drink it. We will all drink it." He had not lived for patience. He would taste the truce as one tastes a fruit when the knife slides in and the perfume lifts. He would watch how it stained the fingers. Walder Frey read the thick paper in his solar and spat into the fire and laughed and spat again. "So," he said, "so. The boy goes home north someday by a road that passes my gate and thinks to pass with his head still on his shoulders. He thinks to pass without dancing. He thinks to pass." He rubbed his thumb along his lip and felt the sore there. He worried in sleep. He had wanted more than a letter. He had wanted a king to kneel on his sour rushes. For now he went to table and dipped bread in broth and called it a supper. Outside his tower the river slid on, the same as it was yesterday, the same as it would be tomorrow. Roose Bolton listened to the note read aloud with his eyes lowered, as if he were making a short list in his mind and then crossing the items out in turn with a small internal blade. He made no comment. He did not believe in declaring aloud the things that could be accomplished in silence. Later he took leeches and let them swell at his wrists and thought of a quiet house in the Dreadfort that preferred its doors closed. A truce reassured. Truces gave men permission to set down their shields and turn their backs and go pissing. He did not dislike such moments. The truce lived for a week, then two, like a shy animal that had to be coaxed into taking food from the hand. It sent men with messages along roads where the hedgerows were only hedgerows and not ambuscades. The market at Lord Harroway's town took up its stink of fish and onions and was grateful for it. A man whose daughter had been found alive after a sally by Sir Adam Marbrand cried because he had already allowed himself the use of words that belonged to the dead and now had to unlearn them. Letters went between keep, and the wax upon them was a rainbow of coin, a currency in itself. There were exceptions. There always are. A band of Westermen who had forgotten their captain's face struck an oxard and stole his rope and were caught by 4 river men with pitchforks who made them return both rope and ox and stole their boots in return. A pair of Tully outriders took a Lannister courier's purse and then brought it back because someone's mother had told someone else's mother and it had reached ears that could shame. None of the exceptions were yet large enough to say the truce had died. On a night when the river moved like silk and the sky wore no moon and thus more stars, Brynden Tully rode to the place they had chosen for the second meeting, the one where the shape of hostages would be carved. It was a ruined inn by a ford, with ash trees that looked like old men lifting long hands in blessing or warning. The water sounded like the smallest applause. Kevin Lannister came with 10 men behind him and no one ahead, and Brynden came with 12 and made certain the men behind him had been told the story of the trident 3 times over, so they were sick of it and would not try to improve it with their own. They spoke plainly. Each man chewed the words before he said them and then spit the pits under the table. There would be a Mal-Lister nephew at Casterly Rock, where he would learn to hold a fork with such surety that he could stab nothing with it, and a Crakehall boy at Seaguard, where he would learn that the sea does not pity those who do not respect it. There would be a niece of Fry fostered at Riverrun, and a piper's son at Rosby. The Fry name did not please Kevin, and he did not hide that. He wrote it down anyway, an even line, carefully formed letters. Brynden watched the writing and found in it something like the man himself, lacking in vanity, strong in application. "And the Kingslayer?" he said. Kevin's mouth tightened in a way that had nothing of anger in it and more of hurt. "He remains where he is. Your king may have his oath upon this, if he requires it. He will have it whether he is a king or no." Brynden kept his face flat as a targe. He was thinking of Karstark and the way men's grief makes a blade of their bones and then bleeds them on it. He was thinking that a truce is sometimes only a way to measure who will betray whom later most efficiently. His voice when he spoke was only his voice. He will have it. The night wore on and the river never tired of making its pattern upon the stones. In the last hour before dawn, when soldiers think of their mothers or their whores depending on whether they are cold or merely lonely, Kevin lifted his head as if listening for a sound that had been too far off to hear and had now come close. "You should know," he said, and he was not speaking here as envoy but as man, "that this work cost my brother something he would have preferred not to spend. He does not like being made to spend. If you force him to do it again, he will find some other coin to use. And none of us will like what that coin turns out to be." Brynden drank a mouth of river water and grimaced as if it were wine. "There is little I like," he said, "that I have not earned by outlasting men who wanted to deny it me. If the gods are kind, I will die of boredom somewhere clean. They are not kind, though. I have made my peace with that. Perhaps your brother has not." At dawn, Myrcella went into the Queen's garden as she had promised and showed Tommen the steps of the Dornish dance. He tried to keep up and laughed a little when he could not, and then laughed again with more ease because she did not mock him. Joffrey watched from a bench and made a remark about the vulgarity of foreign steps, then a second remark that tried to nettle and failed because it was built on something smaller than what was real here. Cersei sat with her hands in her lap and remembered teaching Jaime to dance because there had been no one else. The way their feet had knocked against table legs and their laughter had been high and pure. For a breath she saw her children as small again, and then the sight passed like a shadow from a cloud. Sansa, who came to the garden at that hour because she had learned the hours when her walking would cause the least mischief and the fewest words, stood under a lime tree and watched Myrcella dance and did not move because if she moved she would cry. She saw the shape of home and thought it was cruel of the world to make shapes without being willing to fill them. Then Myrcella saw her, and in that simple recognition there was unlooked-for charity. Myrcella ran to her and took her hands. "You must learn," she said, and her smile was sunlight that had decided to stay. "It is all in where you place your weight." Sansa wanted to say, "I have no weight at all. I am light enough for the wind to carry me." Instead she nodded and allowed herself to be turned and shown and corrected. "Place your foot there." She did as she was told, and for 3 heartbeats forgot that she was counting days in her head and measuring her speech as if it were flour. On a hill north of the neck, a rider paused and lifted his face to smell the air. The wind there tasted of salt and of the long grasses that had learned to bend without breaking. A great black bird hung briefly against the sky and then folded like a thought and was gone. The rider adjusted his seat and let his horse rest and then urged it into motion again. There were worse signs. The world had not ended. It had merely changed its tempo. In the Dreadfort, a man with pale eyes stood and watched his leeches collapse and thought of the new emptinesses that peace made. He thought of how useful they could be. In the Twins, a man older than he believed any man deserved to be alive tapped his fingers to a rhythm that only he heard and decided where he would place a cup at the next feast so that it would spill upon the person he most wished to watch scramble. In Seaguard, Patrick Mal-Lister took ink from a pot aged as he had been by the sea's breath and wrote a letter asking whether his nephew would be made to pray at a sept, and knowing the answer would be yes and that it would taste of bitterness for a time and then not taste at all. In King's Landing, Tywin slept briefly. He had always prized the discipline of an economy of sleep that made his hours long. and woke with his mind already building beam to beam. There would be decisions to take, so many decisions. There would be the reach to keep pleased without ceding the city to pigeons and roses. There would be the Iron Bank's patience to test without breaking it. There would be Stannis's hound's persistence to measure, and the unquiet of a realm that had been told to be quiet. There would be his son's eye upon him and his daughters, and neither would be as grateful as they should. He rose and washed his hands in water that had been warmed all the way through in a copper basin and dried them slowly. He lifted the pen and bent to the day. The Truce sat on the table near his elbow as if it were a little pet he had allowed to stay, and every now and again he fed it a word. He did not know then which men would not be quieted by this calmer season, and whose hands, that had been taught to make war, would itch in idleness and do something with that itch. He could not foresee which blade would be turned steadily upon which throat, not with blood hot in the stroke but with blood cool and deliberate. He did not know which child would choose which god to call upon and be answered. He knew only that he had bought room enough to draw breath. Often that is a kingdom's whole wealth. And in the water gardens, at the quietest hour when even birds are too full of sun to sing, Ariohoda stood as he did each day and felt the weight of his axe in his hands and watched children splash water upon each other and saw Myrcella's absence precisely in the space between two faces. He listened to the far murmur that meant the mountain's breath continued. He closed his eyes and saw the 2 points as if they were pins placed in a map. He imagined a thin thread drawn between them that would not break even if both ends tugged. He had come to believe that much of life was the finding of such threads and the deciding when to pull and when to leave them slack. She would dance in the capital's garden, and somewhere a wolf would lift its head and taste a scent carried from very far away. Somewhere, a man who loved vengeance more than wine would sip wine and tell himself it was vengeance and not know the difference. Somewhere, a father held the whole of a kingdom's face in his mind and told it how it must look to be spared the worst of its ugliness. He would only be able to tell it for a time. Then it would do as it liked. The river ran, the sea breathed, the desert slept, and the ink dried on letters whose words waited like men behind a door, ready to act the moment they were read. In the city that had never been quiet in Tywin Lannister's lifetime or perhaps in any man's, the Truce made a very brief, very vivid silence, like the hush after a cup spills and before anyone moves. That was not nothing. In such silences, sometimes, futures are laid. A raven beat its wings toward the north with 2 lines of script tied to its leg, one addressed to a house that had always believed its honor more valuable than its meat, and the other to a house that would sell either if the price was decent. The bird knew nothing of honor or price. It knew the curve of air under the wing and the way sea smells move inland at evening. It knew the distance it must go and went. Above, the stars continued their old ship's slow turning. Below, men and women counted them for luck and made wishes that would not be answered yet, if at all, and then slept because even in a truce there are watchmen and farmers and cooks, and on the morrow they must work. At dawn, a frost of mist lay along the red fork and made pale beards of the reeds. Men came to the riverbanks and forgot to speak because the hush of morning is work and cannot be done with tongues. Karstark did not forget to speak. He stood by the field where the tents were staked in a long, obedient row and spoke and spat again. His boots white with dew and his beard slick where he had not wiped it clean. He had the look of a boulder that no one remembered placing and that had not learned to move since. "They send him to Dorne," he said, and his voice did not rise. Rage in him lived low like the slow part of a fire that hides in coals. They send him to lie on pillows and drink fruit water while men's sons rot in the ground they never got to see from the height of a horse. If I had thought I lived all my years to see this day, I would have died earlier out of courtesy to myself. The men around him made assenting grunts the way oxen do when they heave together, not because they understand the field they pull through but because heave is what they know. They were Karstark men and they wore his grief as if he had issued it with the bread and cheese. One of them, a black-haired boy who shaved twice a month in honor of a beard that had not yet begun even in earnest to fail, said, "They will put hooks in him, my lord. Dornishmen are sly. He will not have a good death." "My sons had not a death of any sort that could be called a word and be done with," Karstark said. They had their lives turned to meat and not even to sausage, which is at least a work. They had a butcher's heap. He will be given a narrative for the bards. He will be given an ending. I would prefer a plain piece of rope and a branch thick enough to hold him. He turned away as the blackfish rode up, the horse's breath aplume. Brynden Tully had the light upon him that makes certain old men at dawn look carved to endure the day and to be carved again tomorrow if required. He looked at Karstark and did not look away. "Lord Karstark," he said, "there is no lord in a camp where sons lie under canvas without breath." Karstark answered, and made a little motion of his hand that could have been politeness or contempt. "There is a wolf who makes treaties with cats who think themselves kings of kitchens. The truce feeds our people," Brynden said. "You will see that with your own eyes before the week is out, and then you may come here again and spit, but there will be less bile in it because some of the hunger will have been cooled." "Your tongue has salt on it," Karstark replied. "It has been in the sea a long time and learned the sea's patience. Mine has been in my own mouth with my own dead in my thoughts. It has learned other words." He stepped closer, and men stepped in turn, because they are beads on strings that long habit keeps them from tangling. "You cannot make me love this with good arguments, Blackfish." "You are not required to love," said Brynden, and let the horse edge forward a pace so his rider's knee brushed Karstark's coat. "You are required not to betray. Between those two there is a wide field where men may stand, and many stand there and do not fall ill." Karstark's face worked with an old pain and a new insolence. "I took my oath to your brother's nephew when it meant war," he said. "If it now means being made to watch a murderer be led to a sunlit bed far in the south, I will need to be told when I swore to that also." The Blackfish's eyes narrowed very slightly, which in such a face was as much as a younger man's shout. "Do not take stroke from your grief and swing it at such a height that you cut your own throat," he said softly. Karstark laughed without humor. "I am not a boy," he said, and turned and went through his men, who opened like grain before a scythe. Catelyn heard of the conversation and did not at first go to seek Karstark because she knew the devilment of following rage when it is fresh. Rage wants an audience the way an infant wants milk. If it does not get it, sometimes it sleeps. She walked the walk between the kitchens and the little sept with the unlovely cracked icon of the mother that had come with the army from a village that had been burnt. She went into the sept and placed a hand on the rough wood where the crack wandered like a river down the saint's face, and she told the mother a fact that was not a prayer, though it had been shaped like one by habit. "I will not lose this to my own, after all we have lost to others." She went to Robb then and found him with his maps and his firm mouth and the way he had lately of pushing his hair back because his hands needed something to do when not on sword or pen. "Karstark must be handled as if he were a horse that will take a bit and then bolt anyway if he smells a ditch," she said without preamble. "Set men to watch the Lannister captives and do not put Karstark men in the room with them. I do not believe he will move by day. Grief prefers night." Robb looked up with fevered patience. "He will be punished if he does," he said. "I cannot keep him sweet with sugar made from my own honor." "Do not prepare your sentence before you are made judge," she said. "Do not say the words you will say with a sword in your hand while you still have the map pin in your fingers. Let the thing come to you and call itself by its name." "I am not a boy," he said, and then smiled because the words had been Karstark's. "I will not say them. I will stand where you tell me and not move until I must." He reached for the pitcher and poured a cup and did not drink it, as if his thirst were unworthy. "Do you remember?" he asked suddenly. "Fishing in the eddy below Riverrun when I was small, and you told me to wait for the shadow to pass before casting or the fish would see the hook shine. I always wanted to throw regardless. And sometimes you did," she said, and brought up weeds and felt very triumphant and then had them wilt in the sun. "This is like that." She placed her hand on his wrist and the bones felt like a man's bones and not a boy's. "Wait for the shadow." He waited. Karstark did not. 3 nights later, under a moon as thin as a girl's wrist bone, men came inside the tent where the Lannister squires slept on pallets and whispered a command with knives. The boys did not die like men in songs. There were bubbles of spit and an ungainly flailing. One of the killers could not finish his stroke and another had to take the work from him as if it were a misused tool. Outside, a Karstark banner did not stir because there was no wind. When the bodies were found at Gloaming, the camp made a single sound that traveled as from throat to throat and sat then in the men's chests like a lodged bone. Robb did not draw breath a second longer than he needed to. He had Karstark summoned and the men with him, and the men denied nothing because rage, when sated, likes to call itself justice. They were wolves' prey, one said, striking his breast. We only hastened what the gods had written in the meat of their hearts. Robb listened and then spoke. You were my men, he said. You took your oath to me, and now you have cut it in two and thrown the pieces in the river. You have made me a liar, for I promised safe conduct to those under my roof. By killing them, you have given the lions the right to call me Oathbreaker. Karstark's face had become a thing with tight corners, as if he had been nailed together out of wood and would split if struck. You made yourself a liar when you sent away the mountain wearing chains borrowed from Mercy, he said. Do you think I would not answer? Robb felt the weight of all the eyes. His mother's gaze at the tent's edge was a fact, like the angle of the light. The blackfish stood with his arms folded. Lord Umber snorted as if something amused him against his will and then became stone again. Robb's voice when it came was very even and slightly low. I am sorry for your sons, he said. I will be sorry for them until I die. I am king. I cannot be sorry for what must be punished. If I do not punish this, then I am a boy with a crown and a dog. I am not a boy. Karstark stared, and for a heartbeat Catelyn thought he would kneel like a man who has been told that the god he has chosen is not the only god and wishes to offer some compromise gesture that will satisfy both altars. Then he closed his mouth until his jaw creaked and gave a nod that did not concede the argument but acknowledged the sentence. Do it, he said. Do it straight. Do not let some other man's hand help yours. He did it straight. In the morning, where the mist burned clean and the river went silver at the bend, Robb Stark took Ice's naked sister, the great sword a Stark carried in war because the larger one had gone south on a promise, and hewed Karstark's head free while men watched with their mouths set. The body fell like a log on a shore, and the head landed on its cheek and rolled and then stopped, looking at the river as if surprised. The blood made its creak and ran. So many men prayed under their breath that the air felt full of moths. He lost half the Karstark levies by sunset. They saddled and went with the looks of men who join another army in their heads first and then seek it with their feet. No one barred them because no one had orders to, and because even if they had, their hands might have hesitated. Catelyn heard the clink of iron and thought of the thin place where the truce was fabric and wondered where it would tear first. A raven went out of Riverrun that day with a letter tied neat to its leg. It spoke of the crime and of the justice and of the king who had chosen law over convenience. It asked that the Lannisters not take the blood of 2 squires as cause to return to burning. It did not beg. It did not name guilt beyond those who had died and the man whose head had been separated from his sorrow. Kevin read it at a table in a low room in Harrenhal kept clear of spiders by a boy who loved the spiders and relocated them with soft words and a pot. He read it twice. He sent a copy to King's Landing with a courier who counted each mile as if it would move out from under him and drop him if he did not. Tywin read it and said nothing for a long time. He stood at the window and watched the city for which he had paid away so much. The Truce did not die of this. He would not let it. There is a manner by which one does not flinch when struck, and by not flinching, disarms the striker and leaves him suddenly awkward with his fist raised and nowhere to bring it down. He wrote a reply that acknowledged the king's justice and recognized that some men would always act from their private pains, as if the realm were fashioned to be the theater for their grief. He did not threaten. Threats feed hunger. He sent with the letter a small chest that contained the writs by which he had stripped lands from Ser Gregor, as if shielding law with parchment made it more than bone. He sent another raven to Dorne that told Doran Martell of this matter, not because Doran would care, but because Doran liked to have the entire diet on the table before he let the wine be poured. In the water gardens, the mountain's breath made the air in his chamber a constant burden. Tyene sand burned herb sprigs upon a charcoal brazier and murmured the names of saints and vices. She liked to name them together to teach herself the difference. Nymeria cleaned her nails with a knife and asked once each day in the most polite tone if she might be allowed to go in and make him speak. Obara asked the same question without politeness and more often. Arianne stood at the window and drew the curtain so that the light fell not upon the prisoner but upon the wall opposite, as if to say, "It is not for you." Doran read Tywin's note and folded it in thirds and then in thirds again and let it rest under his palm. "He asks that our justice be elegant," he observed, smiling slightly. "He hopes we will make a story that is satisfying and can be told at a feast without anyone losing an appetite." "Then let us do the opposite," Obara suggested, her mouth twisting. "Let us make it squalid and slow, and so small that no man can bear to hear it told. Let us make them choke on the details." "No," said Doran.
"No.
"We have been many things in the world's mouth. Let us be the strangest. We will be measured." He lifted his eyes to Ariohota, and the captain inclined his head without any movement whatever of his axe. "Slow," Doran said, "not to please the sand snakes, but to satisfy the law. He will confess each thing he did as we show it to him. He will confess without torture. He will name his sponsor without being asked. He will ask for water. He will die at last. Until then, the sun will be allowed into his room, so that he may see what it looks like when it shines on those who are free." "You expect him to confess?" said Arianne, with a skepticism that had never been able entirely to keep from the edge of her voice when speaking to her father. "Men like that do not confess. They call their deeds by other names and ask to be paid for them again." "Everyone confesses," Doran said, and there was weariness in him older than anyone present. "To someone, to themselves, to the gods, to their daughters, to the man who brings them water, to the floor. We will simply be present when it happens and call it by its right name." It happened the second week, when the heat had grown into the tiles so deeply that it radiated back at night like a sick animal's breath. The mountain had been given plain food and water and a bed of a sort that was not softness. He had been allowed to piss in privacy because dignity is a charity to oneself as much as to others. He had looked at the men who stood at his door without blinking and had not spoken to any. On that day, with Ario seated and two spears in the corner leaning as if in conversation, he asked for water, and when the guard brought it, he lifted the cup and did not drink but said, "I killed the girl." The words fell like a jar dropped. The guard did not move. After a long moment he said, "Which girl?" Because he did not know which one. "There are always girls." "The one with the fat cheeks," said Clegane. He swallowed, perhaps because his mouth had closed on a memory that was not meat. "She looked like a piglet when she cried." The guard stood and looked at him with a face that could not hold it. He went to fetch the prince. When the telling was done, Doran had not moved and did not move after. He said quietly, "We will ask him tomorrow about the boy. We will not count this as a kindness to the dead, because they do not need it. We will count it as a clarity for the living." He dismissed the guard and sat while the light moved from one side of the room to the other, counting it with his pulses like an old man counts coins and finds some joy in their worn faces. Oberyn, when told, laughed with a sound that had metal in it. "And we had thought it would taste of orange and lavender," he said to Illyria. "But instead it tastes of dust and spit and the little flecks of blood you find in your mouth when your gums have been torn." He was a man who loved words when they came out hot. Now he loved them when they came out cool. "We will call it justice," he said. "We will not call it revenge. We will leave revenge to lay its own eggs in the dark." He wrote to his brother and said that he would go to King's Landing as envoy when the time came, and Doran said, "Not yet," and placed the letter in a drawer that smelled of cedar until its scent had soaked into the page, so that when it was finally sent, the capital would think itself smelling forests instead of the desert. In the capital, Littlefinger returned from the Reach with roses on his breath and a writ folded in his boot. He had convinced Mace Tyrell of many things Mace liked to be convinced of, among them that he was wise and beloved, that his daughter would be queen of a realm much soothed by his own good sense, and that debts can be printed as honors on paper and hung in a hall to impress guests rather than paid in coin. Peter wore satisfaction like a new shirt and kept himself from preening only because preening has ruined many a good shirt. He found Varys in the half-dark of a colonnade and smiled the smile a snake makes when it senses a bird has not yet noticed it. "Back?" said Varys with that benevolent indifference he had made into a creed. "How fragrant! It is as if the very idea of the reach has been distilled and poured behind your ears." "And you smell," Peter replied, "of boats left in water too long. Why is that?" "Because the sea keeps secrets better than men do," Varys said. "Do you like what you came home to?" "Truces give men ways to compute their enemies and plan dinners," Peter said. "The city eats better under this than under a siege. They will sing the hand's praises in the markets. I hope he enjoys the melody. It will sour." "And you will add the lemon," Varys said. "I will leave the lemon tree where the soil is poor and watch better gardeners fail." Peter's eyes went to a window where the sky was the particular yellow that comes before a storm that means to disappoint. Myrcella back, the mountain gone. Carp from the mander baked in the kitchens of lords who once claimed they did not like fish. A pity for those who like flames and spectacle. A happiness for those who like to poison wells. "Do you plan a particular well?" Varys asked. "I plan only to watch water," Peter replied. "It is useful to know where it flows too fast and where it gathers. Ladies slip often near gathered water." He thought of Sansa Stark with her hands in Myrcella's as if prayer had joined them. He thought of a ship and a mask and a careful panic staged in a garden. He thought of how quickly a girl learns to believe the first hand that looks like rescue. He looked then at Varys and smiled again, different this time. "And you?" "I plan to keep the realm," Varys said, and he meant it. And his meaning lived in his belly like a lump of iron that kept him always a little heavy and a little tired. There was talk then of weddings. The city had learned to talk of weddings as if they were rain after fire. Marjorie Tyrell came with her smile like a small, clever knife that could open any fruit without spilling its juice, and Joffrey performed courtesy as a boy performs a tune he has been ordered to practice, too loudly and with the wrong notes emphasized. Cersei stood behind and watched, the mother of the groom and the mother of the child he had been at once, and counted how many of the girl's steps were toward her son and how many were toward the crown. She could not keep the numbers straight in her head because every time she thought she had them one way, they slid and she had them the other. Sansa felt herself an actor whose lines had been rewritten and not given to her before she walked on stage. Once she had thought herself a princess. Then she had learned how easily a princess can be a prisoner when her name is a chain around her own ankle. Now she was told she was free of her betrothal and yet was not free at all. The truce had sent different scripts into hands everywhere. She walked with Myrcella and Marjorie among the lemon trees and carried a basket and had her fingers sticky with fruit pulp, and for an hour it felt like life. Then the bells from the sept reminded the city that it belonged to religion as well as to rule, and the hour was put away. Tyrion went to see Shay and she was cross because he had been late and explained himself with the truth that would make her angrier, that he had been watching his niece dance and had been moved and had then been disgusted at having been moved, and being both at once had made him late. She did not care for the inside of his head. She cared for his coin and his cleverness as far as it kept her comfortable and for his body as far as it eased hers. He told her nothing of Sansa because he had learned that some truths are stones that thrown into a basin make the water leap out, and then there is more cleaning to do than you have towels for. He slept little and dreamt that he stood in a hall full of pillars and that he passed each one with his hand upon it, and it was not stone at all but men, and when he tried to cry out they all turned their faces, and their faces were blank as unfletched arrows. He woke and laughed at himself and then did not laugh because the laugh had sounded like his father's when he found a cost to be both justified and also somehow insulting. In the north, men sharpened axes for work that was not battle because winter had not yet come but had sent notes that it had not forgotten them. They looked south and heard rumors as you hear the breath of an animal behind you in the woods and cannot tell what shape it has or whether it has seen you. Roose Bolton's letters reached the king there and were polite and had no clumsiness to them at all. When Robb read them he felt as if someone had placed a cold piece of iron along his spine and then removed it as if only to judge his flinch. He marked words on a scrap for answer and then threw the scrap in the brazier unread because he had composed politeness to answer politeness and knew it would be sufficient and despised it. Under a different sky, Stannis Baratheon burned driftwood in a long line and watched the sparks fly up like a host of defeated foes running. The queen's men chanted the names they had been given to chant. Melisandre stood with her eyes half closed and her face very still, and Davos stood with his jaw set and his hands folded to keep himself from reaching out to stop something that could not be stopped because it was a belief, and belief enters men by 1,000 cuts and bleeds out none of them. The truce in the south meant one thing only to Stannis: that the field he would one day plow would be full of stones others had placed to break his plow's blade. He looked to the fire and muttered aside to Melisandre without taking his eyes from it. "When they grow sleepy with peace, then we will wake them with a trumpet. Trumpets are for the deaf," she whispered back. "The blind listen to the wind." "I am neither," Stannis said, "and yet I cannot see what you see when you look in your flames." "You can?" she answered and smiled, and he had the sudden furious desire to be rid of her and knew it for a temptation the way a man knows the temptation to throw down his sword when it is heavy and his hand is tired and the enemy seems thinner for a blink. He did not throw it down. He did not dismiss her. He went to his maps and drew little lines upon them, neat and spare, as if by economy of ink he could show the gods his frugality of desire. Davos went to the boy. He sat with Edric Storm and told him tales of onions and of smuggling and of sitting out storms in coves no one knew just because they had not bothered to name them. He was not clever with words the way other men are, but he had found that a word spoken by a man who has salt long dried in the creases of his hands sometimes settles a boy's heart more than many fine phrases spoken by men whose hands keep ink and ladies' waists. He did not trust Melisandre's gaze upon the lad. He did not trust any woman whose smile had the habit of being precisely as wide as the thing she wanted required it to be. As the truce aged into its second month and showed the lines events draw in any face, there were meals taken in Riverrun where men from both camps sat on benches and leaned their elbows on the same tables. They did not speak much because it is wiser to let the bread say what it must by being broken. A Crakehall boy came to Seaguard and learned the names of gulls and the sound each species makes before storm and after, and that there is a difference. And at Casterly Rock a Mallister nephew discovered that there are rooms carved into stone that hold the sea's constant mutter like a cup holds wine, and that one may sit in them and hear the world's old talk. He missed home. He did not cry. He learned when to speak and when to listen in a house where words are chosen the way arrows are chosen for a fight where few will be loosed and all must fly true. Walder Frye decided to hold a feast to celebrate nothing at all and invite few and chose only those few he knew would not come, that he might add their names to his list of slights. He purchased new rushes for the hall and did not change them when the dogs pissed in them because anger likes a smell. He spoke to his sons as if he were speaking across a river and they had not yet arrived. He dreamed once that a bride floated down the green fork on her back, her gown spread around her like a water lily, and in the morning told no one because telling a dream gives it claim on you and he would not be claimed even by his sleep. Arya moved with the Brotherhood without banners and learned 24 names for the color of dusk in the Riverlands and none of them named home. Tom O'Seven sang less now because the truce made a silence around them that songs did not wish to break. Thuras prayed and fell asleep sometimes with his hand upon the pommel of his sword and woke ashamed because he had been a different man once, and it is cruel to be called back to a standard one cannot stand at. The Hound came under their gaze and then under their justice and, because justice in men's mouths so easily becomes spectacle, fought and won and left, and Arya learned again that the gods like to show their will at the very spot where men had placed a scaffold and drawn a crowd. She slept in barns and in hedges and once in the crook of a very old oak where the bark smelled like something she remembered from the yard at Winterfell and woke crying because she had not dreamt she was back at home and felt she had betrayed it by not even dreaming of it. Sansa went to the sept with Myrcella and knelt, and the stone under her knees seemed not unfriendly, which was a relief, because oftentimes the city stones felt like an enemy under skin, something pressed, something used. Myrcella prayed in the way she did everything, meticulously, with politeness toward the act. She whispered, "Thank you for coming back, and please help me to do the dances right and Lou. Tommen not stumble so much because it makes him cross and I do not like him cross." Sansa prayed without words until the end when she found a very small one. "Let my mother know I am not forgotten, and if that is too much, then let me not forget myself." Joffrey grew tired of being praised for grace and did some little cruelty each day as men stretch when they have been held to too strict a posture. He had a boy whipped for dropping a platter and laughed in a way that reminded Cersei of their father and made her proud and ashamed at once, which is a tightrope no one may walk forever without falling onto one side and breaking something. On one afternoon, he ordered a cat be brought to him, saying he had heard the Dornish liked to use catgut for certain bows, and he wished to see how strong the string was. Tyrion interposed with a soliloquy about the music of different regions, and how cats sing differently in the alleys of Lannisport than along the spear towers of Dorne. Joffrey listened and then looked bored and dismissed the cat, and Tyrion was surprised at his own relief and disgusted by it because he had made himself a man who gives speeches to save cats. Amory Lorch, who had made a study of survival that kept him alive in years when better men did not bother, was found in a village near Stokeworth drinking vinegar wine and telling a story with too many instances of the word brave in it. The men who took him wore no colors and spoke sparingly and put him in a cart and covered him with burlap and made very few stops because they had learned in this kingdom that any time you stop in a village long enough to eat hot food you leave part of yourself behind there, and sometimes the part you leave is blood. He was delivered at last to a cell that had once held sacks of barley and now held him, and he shouted to be seen and was not indulged. Tywin received notice and wrote in the margin of his days list one small word: done. He sent to Dorne an additional offering, not Lorch immediately, for he wished to savor the man's arrest as one savors a dish when one has waited too long for it, but a chest of books that had belonged to a maester who had died in a siege of Sunspear a century gone. They had been taken as plunder and sat dusty in the Roxforth library, the most ill-used of that citadel's libraries, as it contained the thinner books, and had gathered a particular scent of neglect. Tywin ordered them brushed and the bindings oiled and their dedications copied in a neat hand and then packaged as if to please a man who cannot be pleased by sweets but will note the tray's polish. The note he sent with them said nothing about Elia or children or blood. It said, to replace something taken long ago by men who did not ask me first. Doran read the note and smiled because gifts are the language of men who wish to stop using knives for a time, and both men spoke that language in accents no one else in their houses understood. He sent back some bitter oranges and a small carved box of red sandalwood that had been Elia's once and which had sat empty since she died, and he had not known what to place within it that would not make of the box a reliquary. Tywin unwrapped it and held it and smelled it and placed it in a cabinet and did not open it again for a long time. At the fords, carts went through with sacks and bundles, and a woman with a dog who would not leave the cart even to run at the river because it had learned that when it left, it could be left. Edmure tried to improve the crossings with men whose only knowledge of bridge work was that they had walked over one often and did not like it when boards were missing. It was a mess for a fortnight, and then, because men are patient when bread sits at the end of their labor, it became better. Even the phrase were useful because scorn, when properly directed, makes men alert. The weather turned. The rain that had held off came in sheets, as if the sky had finally been able to lift the pot and pour it and did not intend to stop until it was empty. The road to Harrenhal became a slick strip of treachery, and men cursed as they led horses that looked at them with the faces of judges. In that black fortress whose stones hold cold as if they were hoarding it, Qyburn lit a long row of candles in glass and stood with his hands folded as if to pray, though the prayer would have been to knowledge and was thus not one the gods are kind to hear. He thought of the mountain far in the south and felt his mind pick at what it could not have, and he was ashamed and excited because he had discovered in himself a hunger that had nothing to do with hunger. He put the feeling away in a drawer in his mind beside other small bad things that he had kept for years because he told himself they were tools. Robb struck his hand against a tent pole and hurt himself and did not call for a maester because the pain felt like a payment he could understand. He spoke with the Westerlings near the crag and did not expect to speak with their daughter because kings do not plan to speak to girls inside castles. They do or do not, and it falls from the hours like a piece of plaster from a ruined ceiling, startling and then part of the dust. He did speak with her. She had eyes that did not flinch and a way of holding quiet that made his own silence seem less like an emptiness and more like a space where a thought might live. He did not intend to be anything but careful. He was careful, and carefulness is very poor armor against a girl who looks at you as if she has seen the thing you think you hide. Catelyn saw the look in him after and did not name it because naming certain things calls them to you. She tightened her cloak and went to the chapel and told the carved mother the story of patience and asked to be given enough to finish it. She wrote to Sansa and did not send the letter because the truce did not yet allow for private letters. only for official ones. She placed the letter under her pillow and thought of the way girls' cheeks feel when kissed after weeping, and allowed herself to weep just enough to keep the salt in her alive. On a day when the light sat flat upon King's Landing as if it were tired of showing the city's wrinkles, a boy in Mallister Grey walked into the Rock's smallest library and asked a question of an old man who had been paid to dust and not to answer questions. The boy asked, "What are the rules of stones in the game of Cyvasse?" The old man said he did not play, and that was the first true thing said to the boy in that place. The second true thing followed the next week, when Ser Kevin explained to him in a courtyard that men like to think rules fix things, but they very often are only maps men consult as they walk roads of their own that go a different way. The boy understood this as children understand such things, by nodding and then discovering years later that the nod had been the beginning of a thought. In Sunspear, at last, under a white heat that made the world too clear, Gregor Clegane died. He did not die spectacularly. He did not roar and break his chains and take with him 3 men into the dark. He died after saying the boy's name and after saying a different name that none in the room had heard before and would forget because they could not place to whom it belonged. He died as slowly and as deliberately as Doran had desired, and when his breath stopped, Ariohoda closed his eyes with a hand heavy and light at once and told himself that sometimes the difference between justice and the act of ending is only who is in the room when it happens. When word came up the long road, it came without flourish. Tywin received it and said nothing and wrote 2 letters, one to Doran with a phrase that did not quite say thank you and one to the Lord Commander of the City Watch instructing that at dusk all taverns south of the Street of Silk were to stop pouring for 1 hour, that men might go outside and think of something other than their cups. The Lord Commander read the note and did not understand it and did it anyway. For that hour there was a strange quiet in a quarter where quiet is normally full of knives. No one later could have said they had thought of justice exactly. They had thought of a man large as a bear lying somewhere they would never see and not getting up again. And sometimes that is all a city needs from the word. Oberyn placed his hand upon an orange and then did not take it. "It is done," he said to Ilaria. "It is not undone. That is, for once, the same thing as satisfaction." "Will you go to their wedding?" she asked, lying with her foot around his calf and drawing small circles with her toe because she liked to lay claim without the ugly work of saying mine. "I will go when my brother bids me go and when I choose to," he said, which is what men who are obedient say when they are proud. "I have other things to do. There is a rumor that a certain Sellsword captain has been seen in the Stepstones who owes me money, and I always collect debts, especially when they are small enough that the debtor has forgotten them. Small debts make men honest. Large ones only make them afraid. Some men," she said, "do not know the difference." "Those are the ones who say the wrong thing at dinners," he answered, and rolled her onto her back and kissed the place under her jaw where laughter lives. The truce held. It did not shine. It did not grace poems because poems prefer extremes. It was hard bread and water and the scrubbed bowl that held them. It allowed caravans to pass. It allowed news to travel the way news likes to, carried by people who have nothing to do with it and do not care whether it arrives except that it gives them something to say when they are lodged for the night in an inn they have not seen before. It allowed the notion of tomorrow to grow again in places where tomorrow lately had been only a repetition of today with the door burned off the hinge. It also made space where mischief worked. Roose Bolton wrote to men who would not have read his letters during hot war because they would have been busy or dead. Now they read and wondered whether aligning themselves with the winter men might keep them warm. Walder Frye entertained a traveler who told a joke and then was beaten because the joke had made a grandchild laugh, and Walder had not liked the way the laughter had made the boy's head look as if it belonged to someone about to break free. Littlefinger met a singer and paid him to learn a different tune. Varys sat with a map turned over and drew not roads upon its back but lines of names, and then set his palm upon the center of the web and pressed down gently to feel how the tension distributed. On Dragonstone, Davos found a book about the old kings who had ruled before men wrote so confidently, and he sounded out the words because letters had never been his business. He read to the boy. He did not think he was saving him thereby. He thought he was doing something decent with a day that might otherwise be given to worry. Melisandre looked into her fire and saw a wedding with iron in it and laughter above a table and then a sound like a dish breaking, and she smiled and would not say why. She told Stannis he should be an iron rod through the happenings to come, and he said, "I am tired of rods. And she answered, "Then you must learn to be a wheel." And he said nothing because he did not like the taste of the words and could not spit them out. Sansa dreamed of snow. She dreamed of the sound it makes when stepped upon in the yard at Winterfell, a soft crust under a softness. She woke to the street's clamor and the heat pressing a hand over her mouth and Myrcella's breathing. She did not know she had said her sister's name aloud until Myrcella sat up and took her hand and said, "We will find her." Sansa did not ask how. Children say such things, and sometimes they prove true and sometimes they do not, and in the moment of their being said, they are a gift you do not unwrap for fear of finding it smaller than you hoped. Tyrion sat with books and with a small knife trimming a quill and told himself he was content to be clever. He told himself that those who save cats with speeches must find contentment where they may. He remembered for a moment the slap of the sea against a hull when he had first crossed to the Vale under Catelyn's command, and how fear and fascination both had lived in the slap. Then he put the memory away because it had no profit in it and because it had a woman's face all over it, the face of a woman who did not love him and had every reason not to. He composed a list of the city's drains that needed clearing and felt that this was the closest he came to virtue, cleaning others' filth. Tywin slept with his jaw tight and woke with it tighter and went to his papers with a hunger that has nothing to do with meat. The truce had given him leeway. He would spend it. He would fix the court around him like stones around a hearth, so that when the winter came they would still warm his side and not roll. He wrote to the Rock and to Lannisport, to Old Town and to the Iron Bank. He wrote to the Vale again with a different compliment. Men in the Vale like to be told their mountains are beautiful. He told them that their winds are honest. He received a reply from Lisa Arryn that described the health of her son in such detail that he felt for a moment the desire to fold the letter so small it would vanish, and he would not have to be polite to madness. He wrote anyway. He wrote beautifully. He thought, as he wrote, that certain women had been given men's tools and used them strangely, and that he had spent his life tidying after the strange uses of other people's hands. News of Gregor's death reached the river and settled there the way silt settles, and men were glad and then returned to worrying about their cows. Karstark's head had made its dash for the river and not reached it. Robb walked sometimes to the place where he had stood with the sword and felt the ground under his feet as if it belonged to someone else now. He told himself he would not be trapped by one moment, that he would not let that act define his kingship. He said the words and then lay awake hearing them echo and could not decide whether they were true or only meant to be. He went to the Westerling girl more often than he should. He did not yet know all the prices he would pay for that. It is a mercy that we do not know all prices in advance, or we would never buy anything and starve. The sand snakes visited the water gardens less for a time, as if the absence of the girl had made the place look too much like a painting that had had the wrong color scraped off. Doran took his pains and walked the shaded galleries that kept his feet on cool stone and looked out on water and allowed himself to remember a sister's laugh when she had thrown orange blossoms in the air and tried to catch them again before they fell. Areo Hoda stood and watched children splash and thought of the captain he had served in a different city under a different son who had once told him, "We do what we can for as long as we can, and then we are given a last thing to do," and did not know yet what his last thing would be. On a day of high wind, a raven made poor time from the fingers to King's Landing and threw itself gratefully upon a windowsill, its chest heaving. The message was from Peter Baelish and was couched in the bland terms of prosperity and investment and opportunity, as such messages are when they are meant for those who will read them quickly and feel soothed. Hidden inside it were 3 words that meant a thing to the man who had taught Peter their meaning years ago. Tywin read them and did not let his eyes move from one to the next too slowly. He folded the paper and set it aside, and his mind began working at a new seam he had not known was there and now would mine until his nails were blackened. At night, across all these places and the miles between, the same moon rose and set, and 1,000 men turned in their sleep and turned not toward their wives but toward blankness, because blankness sometimes is gentler. The truce held. It flexed and creaked, and once it gave a little sound like a boat's plank when a heavy step comes upon it unexpectedly. It did not crack. It gave men time to lay in grain. It gave certain women time to teach certain girls the names of dances. It gave old men the chance to clean a watch mechanism that had gone gummy and get it working again. It gave those who plot with paper time to lower their candles and use a finer pen. What it did not give, and what nothing gives, was guarantee. The small god who rules bargains and scales and truces does not promise that no knife will slip between ribs on a day when the sun is out and birds sing. He promises only that if the knife slips, the scales will be there to receive the blood and weigh it with what was gained before. Tywin, who did not pray, understood that God without calling him a god. Catelyn, who did, lit a candle and watched it until her eyes hurt, and then snuffed it and went to her son and kissed the hair at his crown, and the kiss tasted of smoke because the candle had been near. And somewhere in the city, near the street of flour where sacks sag fat at certain hours and thin at others, a girl with hair the color of a field left fallow for a season climbed a wall and looked toward the sea and did not know why she looked except that she did not wish to watch the street any longer. The wind from the water came up and touched her face with a wet hand, and she closed her eyes and opened them, and still the wall was under her, and the sea was before her, and the city was around her, and she was inside a story larger than any she had known. She did not know her name would one day be spoken in halls where men would lower their voices for fear. She knew only that she was tired and that the wall was rough and that somewhere, perhaps, there were wolves sleeping, and she wished she could hear them breathe. The raven that had carried Tywin's reply to Riverrun roost for the night in a tree nearer to a Lannister camp than to a Tully one, and did not know that if it were seen, a boy with a bow might shoot it for dinner and change 2 days of hungry marching into one night of satisfaction. It slept. We all sleep, even in truces. We all rise, even in wars. Between those two, men like Tywin and Doran, like Robb and Stannis, like Varys and Peter, place their pieces and push them and tell themselves that this time the board will stay flat. It never does. But the hand learns the motion all the same and becomes deft. By morning, the city smelled of yeast and horse and things harder to name. Myrcella rose early to take the steps of a dance alone in the garden and forgot the ending and made up another and laughed at herself and tried again and told herself she would write to Trystane and tell him she had invented a new step and he could learn it and they would both be good at it by the time they were married. Cersei watched from a loggia and felt two feelings and held them both because that had become her talent. Holding two feelings and making either seem like all to those who looked upon her. Tyrion passed below with a book under his arm and a headache beginning in the back of his skull and gestured to the gardener about a patch of mold on the west wall and wondered why he cared and then decided he did not need to know why to care. Some men do not need motives to be useful. He would be useful. If the world would not allow him honor, it would be made to watch him do his work well. And north of it all, under a sky that had collected geese and would not give them over until the afternoon, Robb Stark stood on a slope and looked at the river that had been his ally lately and would one day betray him because rivers are loyal to no man. He touched his sword hilt and meant to say a prayer and found he could not remember the words, which frightened him more than anything he had seen all month. He knelt and placed his palm on the earth as if the earth might be the god he could not find and said, in a whisper that would not carry, "Keep them," and did not name whom he meant, because to name them would be to imagine their absence and his heart had not the strength for that. The truce, which had been a thought, had become a season. Men will destroy seasons as easily as they do thoughts, given time. The realm breathed. Somewhere, something made ready to stop the breath. Somewhere, someone who had believed himself born for a different story decided to write his own in blood and salt. The paper on Tywin's table grew taller in a stack, and on Doran's narrower. At the twins, Walder Frey counted spoons. In the Vale, Lisa counted fears. In the south, a girl counted steps. In the east, on a narrow island, a priestess counted flames. The gods counted nothing. They have no need. They have men. The letter Peter Baelish had written arrived in the morning, and the quiet it made in Tywin's study was of a different kind than the quiet made by justice or by ships docking or by the pause between orders given and orders obeyed. He read it, and the corner of his mouth moved in the smallest smile that had not joy in it yet was not cruel either. Opportunity had come in the clothing of prudence. He drew a fresh sheet, dipped his pen, and began to answer, starting, as he always did, with the word he most meant and allowing the rest to conform themselves to it as iron filings arranged themselves around a magnet's pull. It would not be the last letter that mattered. It would not be the last justice. It would not be the last dance. But it would be this one now. And sometimes, in a realm of men and wolves and lions and snakes and broken swords and mended boasts, now is as close to peace as anyone may touch.